Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is actually almost evening in this time of the year. My name is Mikołaj Cześnik, and it is my great pleasure and honor to be on the management board of the Batory Foundation. I would like to welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, to this debate organized by ECFR Warsaw and the Forum of Ideas of the Batory Foundation. Our today's subject is a breaking point, what's in store for Europe after the summit. As you will very well know, after many weeks of wrangling, a sort of compromise over the EU budget has been achieved, over the link between the budget and the rule of law. And we know more or less what the road is towards these huge funds that the European Union wants to spend on recovery after the still ongoing COVID-19 crisis. Today, we want to ask the question, what's the conclusions of the summit? What all the events around the summit mean for the European Union in general, and more specifically for Poland? Or to keep it very simple, who won the summit, who lost, who should rejoice, who should be worried? The Batory Foundation has always been very interested in Europe, in the place of Poland in Europe, hence our many years of cooperation with ECFR Warsaw, the co-organizer of and co-host of this event. And by the way, my co-chair today will be Piotr Buras from ECFR Warsaw. Piotr will be the moderator of today's debate. Welcome, Piotr. And I would like to ask you to say a few words to introduce the main speaker, and I hand over to you. Thank you very much, Mikołaj. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, also on behalf of the Warsaw office of ECFR. It is a great pleasure for us to co-organize this debate. As Mikołaj has already said, we are now after an exceptional summit of the European Union. Before it was over, we already referred to it as a breaking point for the European Union. Was it an exaggeration? Well, today we will try to answer. Well, most certainly, if the veto had happened, as some had expected, it would have been a breaking point. But if we look at the conclusions of the summit, we might say that they could be described as a breaking point as well. Well, from the Polish perspective, we've been following the rule of law debate most closely, and yet it was not the only subject tackled during the summit. So in the end, the regulation linking payments from the budget to rule of law has been adopted. Also, this historic budget of the European Union, which not only covers the main task of the budget, but also the recovery fund, which has a completely different structure than what we used to know so far, but also very ambitious decisions have been made with regard to the climate and climate goals of the European Union. So I think that maybe the entirety of all the events around the summit does deserve to be described as a breaking point. So I would like to propose a discussion on this topic today as well as a development around rule of law, which I expect will be the main subject of today's discussions. Well, as I said, we have been talking about it in Poland for quite some time, and some may get the impression that all has been said already. But in order to oppose this belief, I propose that we expand the scope of today's debate. And in order to achieve it, we have invited excellent guests who are great European experts. Our today's debate will, in short, look as follows. So first of all, there will be three main interventions. And let me tell you immediately who will hold them. Caroline de Gruyter, columnist and journalist at NRC Handelsblad, a Dutch newspaper. But today Caroline is in Oslo, actually, but over Zoom she can be with us. Our second excellent guest, Gerald Knaus, director of the European Stability Initiative and expert on Europe and migration. But also analyzing the topics of rule of law, including in Central Europe. And I've had the pleasure of talking and writing to Gerald about it recently. And our last excellent guest, José Ignacio Torreblanca, head of ECFR Madrid Office for a few years. He was also on the editorial committee of El País and published in this newspaper as well. But of course, this is not everyone, because we have a broader circle of colleagues from Poland and abroad, also excellent experts, whom, however, I will not introduce at this point because it would take simply too long, but they will join us at the round table. They will have a chance to comment on the interventions of our three main speakers. And of course, they will be invited to share their opinions about the summit and their forecast for the future as well. So I would like to begin by handing over to Caroline, and my question to you is, actually I will ask the same question to Gerald and Jose later too. My first question about the nature of the last summit. So what does it change? Does it change anything? What does it tell us about the condition of the European Union? Because the three decisions that I have mentioned seem to have a very seem to be very, very important, and some even say that by accident the European Union seems to have taken a very large step towards closer integration, maybe not towards a federation, but it does seem to be an important moment for the European Union. So my question to you would be how you interpret the last summit and which decisions are most important from your perspective. So Caroline, please.
Thank you, Piotr. First of all, thanks for having me. It's nice to be sort of half back in Warsaw again. As to your question, look, there are several ways of looking at this, but let's just take a step back and oversee the whole battlefield. You know, in like 30 hours, the European heads of state and government have taken a decision on emissions, lowering emissions, 55% lower now, which is a lot. They made a deal about the budget and the rule of law clause in it, which was not very easy either. There will be the COVID fund, COVID recovery fund will be launched now as well. They made a compromise about some sanctions at least, but this was for some already a very big step to Turkey. And what was not on the table was maybe even more interesting, that was Brexit, because and that simply meant they all agreed basically. There was nothing to discuss. So I would say for an ordinary December summit, it was rather a good yield, I would say. I've been covering European affairs for the past 20 years, 10 of which I've spent in Brussels during the Euro crisis and the financial crisis and all that. And each time, all these summits were sold as make or break summits. Europe would cease to exist if there would be no agreement, and so on. And after a couple of years, I just simply I've become a little bit immune for those kind of descriptions, because the EU was invented to solve problems that among member states. And so in a way, when there are big problems in Europe, like we have now, like we always have, the EU simply starts doing its work and doing the rounds and trying to find compromises in all these different fields. And these compromises are never ideal, of course, because that's why they're compromises. So in the beginning, Nikolai was saying who won, who lost. But I believe this is precisely what in Europe we don't have anymore, since we have European integration. You know, that was the old Europe where you won or you lost. And now everybody's supposed to go home with something. And that, so it's enough for everybody to take home. At the same time, nobody's ever completely satisfied, and for good reason. But what that means is that we can continue. And I think if you look at the summit, I mean, this is not the moment in a few minutes to go into all the details at length. We will talk about the rule of law later. I have some views on that, so I'll leave them for the second round. But in general, I think you can say that Europe has moved on in the monetary field, in the environmental field or climate, rule of law, in many fields. So not too bad, I would say.
Gerald, now if I may ask you to say a few words to give us some general remarks on the outcome of the summit from your perspective. And during the next round, there will be questions related to the perspective of your countries. So Gerald will have the Austrian and the German perspectives, but this will be covered during the second round. And for now, could you make a few comments on the general outcome of the summit? Does it change anything for Europe? And what is it? So that would be the first question to you.
Yes, well, thanks a lot, Piotr, and welcome to a lot of friends. It would have been nice to be in Warsaw for this, of course. I noticed exactly 2 years ago, I was in Warsaw discussing with a lot of Polish friends the rule of law, and then singing songs at night with Adam Bodnar. I think we were singing Imagine, and that is, of course, the sort of thing that gives you hope. You imagine a different world, but then we come back the next day and open the newspapers, and we see we are back in the Europe that we all know, which, as Caroline put it so well, is a Europe of frustration, compromise, endless bargaining. I sometimes find that our Anglo-Saxon friends have difficulty grasping the nature of these institutions because they want these showdowns. I'm not sure that would ever work. I'm not sure it would be a good idea, but these showdowns between good and evil and then good defeats evil, that's not how Europe works. But this doesn't mean that there aren't very serious crises that we should pay attention to. And so the question, I guess, that really matters to us now here is this summit providing answers to some of the existential crises we believe are real? Not just imagine, not just hyperbole, not just newspaper headlines, but challenges to the EU that are serious, and if they're not addressed, could go in a very bad direction. Well, I'm not an expert on global financial markets, but what is pretty clear is that since the summer, I mean, we are facing an incredible economic crisis across Europe. I've just read that Spain now has the per capita income that it had last in 1999, just after the financial crisis then. We have tens of thousands of deaths in Spain, in Italy, now in Germany as well. And yet countries have no difficulty selling their bonds. I mean, something has been achieved in the last half year. I mean, if it's a confidence trick, I don't know. I'm not sure we will know for a while, but something reassured people who questioned that in this massive economic crisis with all the debts we've talked about or heard about so much in countries like Italy, Europe is about to fall apart. It's not. I mean, that doesn't look likely, at least for the next few months. That's not little. And this is, I think, why well, you asked me to delay this, but why in Germany, the sense is that this is pretty important. But there is, of course, the second big issue, which was getting a lot of attention, which was, well, money doesn't buy the EU love. That we know. Italy, that's a very generous package Italy wanted and fought for. It's stabilizing the Italian economy in this massive turmoil of the corona crisis. But look at opinion polls. 40% are for Matteo Salvini or the Fratelli d'Italia. I mean, far right or neo-fascist parties today. So the second question is, in addition to money, what holds the EU together? And that can only be a defense of some absolute core principles we can't sacrifice, such as the rule of law, and to be very precise, and this matters to Poland, the idea that in the EU everywhere, we have, at the very least, independent courts, functioning judicial systems, not controlled by governments. We've seen in the last few years, in European countries, not members of the EU, Azerbaijan, Turkey, of course, how quickly you can get back to a totally political justice. And we've seen in recent years, and you all know more about this, how far this process has gone in Poland. And here the question is, did this summit and could this summit provide an answer, an effective response by the EU to this existential threat? Because what is the threat? Well, you all know better, and Piotr and I wrote a lot of things about this also in the last few years. The existential threat is that in the very near future, the European Court of Justice will rule that the core of the justice reform of the Polish government, so the government of a big member state, is in violation of the treaty. That having a Minister of Justice who controls judges and prosecutors and court presidents through disciplinary proceedings is not European and poses a threat. And then this judgment will come. And what do we do when what we already see announced? The Polish government then says, well, we are not going to change what matters to us most. And in that case, in that situation, where will the rest of Europe stand? And here, I think the last few weeks, the debate was a little bit deceptive. As those who've read what my colleagues and I have written know, I never held high hopes for this rule of law mechanism. I mean, this was never, and I don't understand people who think rule of law mechanisms can change Hungary. You know, I mean, this is a separate debate, but because of the nature of the council, the nature of the commission, and it's not a few individuals, you will not have member states ganging up on another member state just because there are problematic things happening in that member state, whether it's Malta or Bulgaria or Austria or Hungary. But what is happening in Poland is more serious. If Poland has a system that the Venice Commission described as reminiscent of Soviet justice, and if Poland has a government that then challenges the European Court of Justice using its constitutional court, the foundations of the EU are at risk. And this solution, this problem cannot be solved again through a rule of law mechanism by itself. So, did this summit provide an answer to this? No. Do we need an answer to this? Yes. And when should the debate on what needs to be done start? Now. I mean, that's the real debate. And that is separate from a lot of what has been discussed most heatedly in recent weeks. And I'm sure we get back to it.
Thank you, Gerald. Well, we've already started discussing the rule of law, which is a topic for the next round. And now I would like to ask Ignacio to give us his comments on the direction that the European Union is going to take after the summit, because there are different opinions. Some people say that this way of financing the recovery fund is a significant change that is going to stay here, and that this rule of law mechanism is a very important element of the integration, and that the climate goals will make the European Union integrate more? Do you think that this standpoint is too optimistic, or maybe you would agree with this statement on the direction that the European Union is going to take now after the summit?
Thank you, Piotr, and thank you to all our friends from the Batory Foundation. I see also some very good friends. Hi, Caroline. We used to do these things over dinner at some point, and it was quite good. Hi, Gerald. Also, is Roland there, whom I haven't seen for ages, but follow very closely as well. So it's so nice to be here. And I'd say, just a direct answer to your question, yes, I think this is a major shift, a major transformation. And I think we just sometimes, it's true that we are optimistic in excess, or we are pessimistic in excess, and people say things have gone worse or things are improving. And I always ask, what is the baseline, for your observation? And very clearly, we here have a baseline. We had a crisis in 2008, which is our baseline model for everything the EU has done or hasn't done, and is doing now, and it compares incredibly favorably what the EU has done this time round. This time is absolutely different, and I'd say this is very important, not only in the reaction of the Franco-German axis from the beginning. We can discuss the Netherlands and some of the Frugals, whether they wanted or tried to rehearse old repertoires at some point, but I think even if they try, they fail, because in the last crisis, every time, and we remember that quite well in Spain, every time Sarkozy and Merkel took a walk to the beach, our country was on the verge of collapse. And the first reactions in that crisis were pretty bad. It took too long to do very obvious things. So we learned how to do things, even if there were some reasons to be, and there may be still around some reasons to be suspicious of how well Italy and Spain and other countries would be dealing or will be taking advantage of this opportunity, which I think are legitimate concerns. It's true that Italy and Spain did not enter this crisis with enough fiscal space because they haven't done fully their homework. But I think this has been absolutely different in the way, both in time, in the policies, in the coalition supporting this, and so on. Then it's not only a policy change or the politics of this which have been important. It's, I think we have to look at the polity, at the EU system as such, which has taken a major step, and especially around the European Parliament and the Commission. We used to tell our students in class that the EU was very extraordinary, that the European Parliament was a very extraordinary parliament, because it worked under the lemma of representation without taxation, which is exactly the other way around, which parliaments have usually operated. It was a parliament which didn't raise taxes, and mostly, and so it was a parliament without that kind of taxation powers. Now we have an European Union and a parliament able to raise these taxes, and therefore being responsible for organizing those things, and that's a sea change. And also those taxes, I think we haven't discussed that enough, are going to have incredible external implications in terms of how the world is said, whether it's green taxes or carbon taxes. They're going to have an impact on the world outside, which is, I think, the third thing, which is absolutely also different this time, that because of COVID has been an accelerator of bad things like deglobalization, fragmentation, the crisis of multilateralism, but it has also been a great accelerator of European awareness of the need to deal with these things. And I think the European Recovery Fund precisely gives member states the instruments to transform themselves internally in a way which will be coherent with what the EU stands for collectively, and will have an impact globally. So, as for the idea that foreign policy begins at home, if we get this right, if we get this transformation right at home, we will become also something which is collectively as such, but also worldwide, very important. And then we have the bonus of Biden's election to finish the year, which is also going to have a very transformative impact on what the EU will be able to achieve. We can get into the discussion about how much has changed or not and so on, but that's, for me, it's enough to read that what Biden wrote, that he said 95% of the people in this world live outside the United States. This is, then you can stand for whatever you want, but he understands the world as it is, even for the United States as the most powerful country in the world. And so there are lots of possibilities at home, in Europe, and globally that are opening, that we have achieved. And I think the European Recovery Fund is a good catalyzer of all those things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nacho. Well, in our conversation, we have already heard about economics a little bit, and I'm very happy to know that we have among us colleagues who understand these subjects very well. Agnieszka Smolińska, Piotr, Arak, Marcin Kędzierski, and I'm sure that later on they will be happy to share their insight on this subject. But before we do that, I would like to ask our three main guests for a comment from their national perspective, from the perspective of the countries, the Netherlands, Germany, and Spain. So, what's the perspective of your countries on what's been happening before the summit, the conflict about rule of law? I know that the Netherlands were one of the most active EU member states, had a strong opinion in this debate, and I would like to ask Caroline to comment on this subject. So what's the perception of these subjects in the Netherlands? Please.
Okay, thank you. It's a very good question, actually. The Netherlands has been incredibly active on this subject, as we all know, as the leader of the group better known as the Frugals, because it's a very ambivalent picture. On the one hand, the Netherlands has never really acted on the rule of law in Europe. It could have done so, it could have gone to court and so on, never did. Second, all of a sudden, I left the country 25 years ago, but I write for a Dutch newspaper, so it's still the country probably I know best. We became front runners on the rule of law issue. So the question is why? I think there are several answers. The first is, I think, the seriousness of the situation, the boiling frog and so on. So it's perhaps not the moment anymore to beat around the bush. Second, a very domestic reason. There are elections coming in March, and this issue is quite popular among the public. That ECFR did a poll recently showing that as well. And third, the issue offers the Netherlands a new sort of a vector for engagement in Europe, for involvement in Europe. There are incredible amounts of seminars organized in the Netherlands, by ministries on this. There was a motion in Parliament just 2 weeks ago that was adopted, where members were asking the government to be more active on this. The Dutch took a very strong line in Strasbourg at the Human Rights Court recently, defending Polish judges. So you see, it's everywhere suddenly for the Dutch. So in a way, I think they're rather happy, and this will please Nacho to no end, but they will be rather happy, I think, to have found a new kind of a subject that they can hammer on, because the Dutch are moralists, And, if you really look closely at this issue, we've been lecturing everybody, mainly in the South, for 10 years now on austerity. And, you should, there's a Dutch expression which roughly translates into every member state should keep their own pants on, like don't rely on others, do it yourself, all that lecturing. All of a sudden, we have a new issue. And it's not that different, because the main issue of this is what happens to taxpayers' money, European taxpayers' money. So again, it's in a way, we're the bean counters, it's about finance. Huh? And again, the direction that this is taking is like, we are better than you are. This is the same. It's very loaded in a moralistic way. So I call it moralism, but in a different version. That's what we see. The question is, of course, will they act now? And I am not convinced, because member states, and Gerald already pointed this out, member states, they never like to act. They never like to sanction one another. Even when it came to the Stability and Growth Pact, they were extremely reluctant to do it, because tomorrow I sanction you, and the day after you get back at me. You know, you try to get even. So they don't like this. And so if they will ever act, I'm still not convinced. And I'm actually, as a last remark, maybe, I don't even think it was very smart of the Dutch. They will obviously not agree with me, but I don't think it was very smart to connect the rule of law to the biggest horse trade that we've ever seen in Europe, which is every 7 years on the budget. Because member states are selling everything, even their grandmother, in order to pay less and receive more. So if you throw in the rule of law, you start horse trading about that too. This is why the Portuguese, for instance, never liked it, because you make it negotiable, and it should not be negotiable. So I'm completely in line with what Gerald says. We should think about a different route. And this includes the Netherlands, because otherwise it puts itself again in a position where it's lecturing everybody and annoying everybody with no result, basically. Let me stop there.
And immediately my question to Gerald. So on the one hand, what do you think about the position of the German presidency and the compromise achieved during the summit? And secondly, what is the way forward that Caroline mentioned? So if the mechanisms that have been adopted are insufficient, as you said yourself, what in your view would be the next step? What should happen, maybe what will happen in this area in the upcoming months or years?
Well, so I can offer you the perspective of an Austrian in Berlin, and I would wonder what Roland, as a German in Brussels, would say about the German perception. But in these last days, I certainly got the sense, and when you read German newspapers, that in Germany, this presidency is being considered a success. I mean, that's the sense of a lot of the parliamentarians. That's the sense of quite a few commentators. You know, commentators are cynical. That's their job, because so much is not working. They need to point out what doesn't work. But overall, there is this sense. But at the same time, let's be clear, there is an incredible array of issues that were kicked into the future or not even mentioned. You know, Germany started this off with this big idea of finally doing away with the lawlessness and lack of concepts on EU borders and migration. This didn't even appear in the conclusions because nothing's been achieved. There is no idea in sight how to deal with this. So we have a collapse of the rule of law from Greek islands to the central Mediterranean, to the Croatian border with Bosnia. The issue on Turkey, very controversial. I mean, the prospect of an EU candidate clashing militarily with EU members was very real in the last few months. And if you, as I've been doing with my colleagues, if you read the Turkish press and the statements by Turkish officials, if you watch the Turkish videos being put out by the presidency, you know, first, it's not new. It's been around for 60 years, this kind of rhetoric at each of these crises, but it's serious. Now, the Germans, because there was no consensus, it wasn't just them. There were lots of countries that, probably a majority, that did not want to be really tough on Turkey for all sorts of reasons, kicked it off to March. Climate change, a big breakthrough, setting a goal, but we've had no shortage of goals. The difficulty is moving to actually implement these things. So if you put all of this together, it's very clear that, and then of course, Balkan enlargement. The Germans really wanted, after years of crisis, finally open accession talks, at least with one country, North Macedonia. Even that didn't succeed. So there's this sense, a lot has been achieved, but from the Chancellery or from the Foreign Ministry, the world looks like just problems piling up. And this is without unforeseen things. And that gets us to the problem of the rule of law debate. I mean, I always found it incredibly optimistic, you know, looking at it as a positive thing. If people think that Germany will just drop its concerns to get compromises on 5 other issues, to just send a strong signal to a country like Hungary. Just as well, Germany will never be in the lead of forming a coalition to be tough on Poland. It just won't. I mean, not the opposition, not the 2 parties in the government. So the challenge will be, if we are really worried about the rule of law, as we are, as I am certainly, about the rule of law in Poland and what it means for the EU as a whole, the challenge will be to focus attention, because with Corona and all these other issues I talked about, which are not yet resolved, the biggest fight is for people's attention. And for this, we need a few governments and a few societies, which, as Caroline put it, are moralistic. You know, one thing that drives, you know, we always say it's just about self-interest, but Orban and PIS certainly, when their discourse is very moralistic. You know, they are defending, they say they believe in something. Well, they're not going to be confronted, if there is a confrontation we can't avoid, on defending independence of courts by purely transactional diplomats. They need to be confronted by parliaments, and you know, the Dutch parliament, which says, no, we can't allow judges to be controlled by a Minister of Justice. That doesn't work. Is this moralistic? Yes. Will it lead to conflict? Yes. But sometimes it's inevitable. But that requires us to be very focused. So we need to, and here we come to the biggest problem for all of us, attention again. You know, how many things do we focus on? Every day, there are like 10 new issues, and then we forget most of that the next day. If we want the European Union to be serious about the rule of law in a big crisis, and we anticipate a crisis, then we now need to focus all attention on this. And the big crisis is, how do we strengthen the European Court of Justice, which is the instrument to defend the rule of law, because it has the mandate and had it for years and is willing to use it. How do we defend the European Court of Justice? So the biggest question of all is, and I conclude with this, if the European Court of Justice finds that the Polish system of disciplining judges, or another core part of the judicial reform of Mr. Ziobro, is in violation of the treaty, and it says clearly this needs to change, and the Polish government goes to its constitutional court and says, no, this goes as, how does the treaty, the council conclusions put it, the national identity of member states and their fundamental constitutional structure. It's in the council conclusions. That's our national identity controlling our courts. We will not give in. What will the other member states do? Will they back the court? And will they be willing to back the court if there is a serious, and this is the core question, a serious sanction? You know, not a small sanction that Hungary and Poland can easily, you know, have shown in the last few weeks. You know, if you get billions, even a fine of a few million, 100 million is not terrible. You know, you can fight for your ideas. You can show you cannot be bought. No, a serious sanction such as, let's suspend funding because there's no longer the basic of the rule of law. Is there a serious awareness in Europe how important this would be? And for this, we need a clear story. We need to keep telling people what's going on. And we need to not be diverted in 100 fights that we can't win. Because if we don't have the attention of a few key players, a few key governments, which are very busy, this fight will be lost.
Thank you very much, Gerald. And the same question to Nacho. You are in Madrid right now. And for obvious reasons, I believe you are the best person to tell us about the Spanish perspective. Among the viewers, we can already see some questions, and there was one of the questions is how this conflict around the veto and the rule of law will affect the opinion the member states have of Poland, including the opinion of Spain. So if you could maybe answer this question, but in general, if you could tell us more about the perception of these issues in Spain. So there is there's a group of, mainly Northern European countries who really support the rule of law. And what is the position of Spain on this topic?
Yes, thank you, Piotr. And I just as a side comment, and I think Caroline would agree with me. That there is a very thin line from moralism to hypocrisy most of the time. And when you live in a Catholic country, you know that the more people boast about morals, the more likely it is that they are not meeting those criteria in their private life. And this is exactly the same with the tax regime in the Netherlands, and also how a lot of people behave toward on these issues. Just have a look at the Tax Justice Network or Oxfam, what they think of the Netherlands as a tax haven. But and I think that's for Gerald. I think in general also, I think it's better to be guided by an ethic of responsibility than by an ethic of conviction, paraphrasing, good old Max Weber. So let's talk politics rather than morals. That is something on which we can agree, disagree, and then find solutions to problems. And this is exactly the problem for Spain when it comes to the rule of law and on this case and this situation created by Poland and Hungary with the link and the veto to the budget, because of course, as a country which fought very hard to come in, to gain membership in a country in which democracy and European integration are two sides of the same coin, a country in which I remember back in 1986 when we joined the EU, I landed in Denmark as an exchange student, and someone told me that the European Union had a democratic deficit, meant a democratic deficit. I say, no way, my country is more democratic because it's member of the European Union. And I think, I guess this is still the same in Poland, of course, and in many other countries, that our countries need to be more democratic, not less, because they're member of the EU. And therefore we should preserve that. And in this, by judging the agreement, and I think many people in Spain were saying, I don't think this is a question of morals. I think this is a question of effectiveness. What would our Polish friends want us to do? What would be best for them? Should we just bring down the whole deal, be absolutely tough, even if that's at the cost of prolonging this veto and damaging the EU in the short term, because we don't really want to alienate people in the opposition in Poland and Hungary, making them feel that Europe has let them down. And we have these discussions with our Turkish friends, time and again. It is not for me to decide what is best for them. I would follow their advice and say, look, how tough should the EU be on Erdogan or on Orban, so as to give you the space to resist those policies and those practices without alienating the image of the European Union? And that's the eternal debate on sanctions. Who suffers from sanctions, who benefits from sanctions if you're just reinvigorating or just providing an alibi for the regime. We're having the same discussion with Venezuela, who's suffering the sanctions and so forth and so on. So in Spain, you may think this is funny, but lots of people resent the fact that we were not sanctioned during Franco time by the US and other countries. It was mostly the European countries who supported the opposition in the fight against Franco, but the US supported the regime all the way through, and therefore now today there is a big deal of anti-Americanism in Spain, because people never saw the United States siding with democracy. You know, Borrell had this very famous commentary in Warsaw that he said, you know, I understand you Poles, you owe democracy to the Pope and the United States, but, you know, we owe 40 years of dictatorship to the Pope and the United States. You know, so we see things from a completely different end, and so you cannot translate those lessons. So, you know, I know it might sound a bit unfair, but based on my experience, I would return the question, you know, to you and say, you know, we should be willing to do whatever you think is best for your interest in terms of, you know, having more space in the opposition to these practices, and we should engage in that dialogue, because I don't think there is a pre-written script on how tough we should be in every instance. If we don't bring the opposition along, it's not part of that, and we don't ensure that they will survive the shock of sanctions that we are imposing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ignacio. Thank you all for your first introductory remarks. And now I would like to open our discussion, so the other participants will join the discussion now. And indeed, we have some great participants of this roundtable. And Renata Mieńkowska wants to take the floor first. And if anyone else wants to take the floor, please let me know. You can raise your hand physically or virtually, or you can let me know in the chat. Renata Mieńkowska, voice over to you. Hello, can you hear me now?
Can you hear me? Fantastic.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay, great. So first of all, thank you for having me. Also, I would like to refer what Gerald Knaus said. I can see two big problems, two fundamental problems related to what Gerald was saying. Problem number one, well, I agree with Gerald 100% when it comes to talking about the rule of law within the public debate, but this is actually part of a more significant and more serious problem I am confronted with when I think about the functioning of the European Union. And I think this is the basis of what we are now talking about. This is a communication issue. The European Union has no idea on how to communicate itself to the citizens, and there is a huge potential, there is a huge need for this communication. And Eurostat, Eurobarometer, they all show this need, and ECFR did some research. Ivan Krastev was the expert on this project. So there was some research on this, I think in July, on how the European citizens perceive the European Union during this time of crisis. And you were able to see this, that the citizens expected the European Union to do something. And the citizens actually counted on the European Union more than on their own national states, and the pandemic confirmed that. So there was a huge potential with regard to the European citizens. They want to have this positive information on what the European Union is doing. Sometimes, of course, the expectations are not realistic, because the citizens expect the European Union to deal with healthcare, and this is not a competence of the European Union. However, still very often it is the case that the European Union gives its citizens a lot of good things, but the member states often take credit for the good things that the European Union is providing the citizens with. And then in countries such as Poland and Hungary, there is this debate on sovereignty of the Visegrad states or the southern countries. However, when there is a situation in which the citizens of countries such as Hungary and Poland do not understand what is going on, because all of a sudden it's not the German guys or the French guys who are the bad ones, but the Dutch one or San Marin, the prime minister. So they are kind of bewildered. What is going on? It's not the French guys who are bad. It's not the German guys who are bad. It's suddenly a Dutch guy who is bad. So there is no serious PR work on the side of the European Union. And now we have Next Generation EU, we have this recovery fund, and this is being communicated by the EU through the traditional channels, which no longer work during this time we have now, which is a time of disinformation, of fake news. And of course, you can try to discipline the countries which are misbehaving, but if Article 7 is not enough, and you hardly have any other instruments to discipline them, when then you cannot really expect the citizens to be happy with the European Union and with what the European Union is doing, and become skeptical in terms of what their own countries are doing. And now problem number 2, what are the judges saying, the judges of the Court of the European Union? One of them is home with me. It is not the European Court that should protect the rule of law in the national countries. It should be the opposition. So the opposition should watch out, should be really careful, and should follow the government, should also alarm if the government are not doing well. And if the opposition cannot do this, we have a problem. So I think Hungary is a lost case. And when we look at Poland, I think the opposition is actually contributing now to Poland taking the path already taken by Hungary. However, I think that the European Union is very rigid, and we can hardly count on the European Union to save us. And we cannot expect the European Court to save us. And we also have German courts like the Court of Hessen, for example, and there are always individual circumstances. So the European Court of Justice cannot make a general judgment and introduce some sanctions against Poland. Because it's always about a specific case. It can never be general. And the communication policy of the European Union should be based on fighting the pandemic and protecting the rule of law in this context. But we need some communication policies from the side of the EU. And right now this is missing. So there are some good things, they are working, and the European Union doesn't seem to perceive this as a priority and to communicate this. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mieńkowska. And I've gathered the people who want to take the floor. Roland Freudenstein from Brussels, from a think tank of the European People's Party. He is well known in Poland, so he's going to take the floor now, and later he'll be followed by Patricia Sansel and Edith Zgud, and they will be able to make some comments on these words that Hungary might be already a lost case.
No, bardzo dziękuję.
Voice over to you.
Dzień dobry wszystkim.
Thank you.
A będę
Hello,
kontynuować po
everyone.
angielsku.
I'm going to
jednak,
continue
to
in
trochę
English
mniej
now
kosztuje
because
mnie energii.
it's easier for me. It's less energy consuming.
Let me make 3 points. First of all, it's great to see so many old friends here. And then I want to make these 3 points. First, as Renata just said, look, this is another attempt in probably a long chain of attempts to somehow help enforcing the rule of law. And we are all perfectly aware that, using the word enforcing is probably already an exaggeration, and it's an impossibility, actually. You know what happens to countries that that have been found to be infringing EU law? They have to pay a fine. And if they don't pay a fine, there are other consequences, but it never goes beyond the financial. There is no mechanism to kick out countries. And so, if Article 7 doesn't work, I think the least thing that we should do, and this is both the remaining member states, but also the EU institutions, the least they can do is raise the cost of going against the rule of law. And the fact that this is not only the Commission, but that there is a, let's say, controlling power of the remaining member states, I think is a good thing, ultimately. Certainly has its disadvantages, but this is as good a thing as we can come up with at the moment. Second point, I think it is, and this is an aspect that has rarely been mentioned in the debate of the last couple of weeks. It is of utmost importance to the external credibility and therefore the power of the European Union to project stability, good governance, and indeed our values to our neighborhood, or also to be China's systemic rival. So for all these things, it is of utmost importance that we do better at least raising the cost of undermining our fundamental values on the inside. Power on the outside rests on being able and willing to do something, even painful, to stick to those values on the inside. And here's my third point. Why I understand why Angela Merkel had to make this comment at the end that, well, it's good that the rule of law was upheld, but also that the fears of Hungary and Poland about, I don't know, their national identity were somehow addressed. The problem with this is that, I mean, you know, to pitch the 2 against the 25 and put them somehow on an equal footing is still understandable for the presidency, which has to be diplomatic and so on. But what I cannot believe is that, for example, political party families such as my own, the EPP, you know, chime in with this and say that, hey, great compromise that we found. No, I mean, it shouldn't even have been a compromise. You know, these are not the real reasons. These alleged fears about national identity and family policy and depoliticizing the procedure about the rule of law, these were not the real reasons why the governments of Poland and Hungary were resisting and making this actually a culture war. The real reasons is that they're afraid that their kleptocratic regimes would suffer. So, you know, all I can say is that, you know, the glass is probably rather half empty than half full. But you know, this result was probably better than having no result at all and the EU at breaking point. But it is by no means the end of the process to start to help enforcing the rule of law in the European Union, which is, I would say, crucial for our ambition to be a global player and to be a stabilizing factor in the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roland, for your 3 points. And before I hand over to Patrycja Sasnal, I would like to throw into questions that appeared on Facebook and YouTube. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, please feel free to comment, ask your questions to our panelists. Tadeusz Krzywda asks about the perspective of a new constitution for the European Union. The Treaty of Lisbon is quite old. Maybe it is now time to renew the legal foundations of the European Union. Maybe time has come for a new treaty that could at least in part address the problems we have been discussing today. And the second question, I'm just throwing it in. So if anyone would like to respond, I will be grateful. Błażej Chorosz asked a question about the rule of law mechanism, whether or not it will contribute to more democratization in the member states, or will it rather support disintegration tendencies? So these are the 2 questions that I just wanted to throw in. And now I hand over to Patrycja Sasnal, Polish Institute of International Affairs. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? So very briefly, I would like to share with you a few comments, maybe one main comment, which is a question in part or an idea. So Just like Caroline, I do believe that the European Union is moving forward and that it is just doing its work. And regardless whether or not this summit was a breaking point, because a lot speaks in favor of this thesis, for example, the pandemic and the upcoming crisis. So I think we can talk about the breaking point now. It also seems to me that we are moving towards more integration, like, for example, the mutualization of debt and strengthening the prerogatives that, for example, in the healthcare area, which used to be very weak, and they reflected. And I would also like to refer to what Renata Mieńkowska said. Yes, the public opinion does wish for the community to have stronger prerogatives, and the support for the European Union is at its historic height. Of course, there are some weaknesses as well. From the perspective of a foreign policy of the European Union, if I may even use this term, it would seem that there are some problems with regard to the South, and not only talking about the Greek-Turkish conflict, but the now emerging anti-Iran camp or anti-Biden camp, but we haven't seen many analyses into this subject yet. But the main point I wanted to make was actually with regard to what Gerald said when he talked about the need to focus your attention and I would say to establish priorities. My boss always says priority is only in singular. But I disagree. We need two priorities. And the first one would be values, because this is the political strength of the European Union in the world. Roland mentioned it as well. So the projection of our values in the neighborhood will not be possible if these values are not maintained on the inside. So focusing on values would be the first priority. And the second one is the climate. And I believe we haven't talked about it much yet because this is an existential threat. And I think Gerald used this word as well and rightly so. So climate goal, 30% of the budget and the recovery fund will be spent on cutting emissions. I believe that it is very important, but it worries me that member states should be doing it at their own pace, which is unclear, and yet the problem is really burning. Of course, the summit did address it in a very significant way, and yet I think what is still missing is this maybe national understanding that we have reached a breaking point, at least in the field of climate. Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrycja. So on my list, I have Edith Skut, Marcin Kędzierski, Piotr Arak, and Eugeniusz Smolar. Of course, other panelists are welcome to take the floor as well. So I'm sure that the list will get longer. And of course, our three main panelists will have a chance to speak as well. And just let me know if you want to respond to anything now. And now I'd like to hand over to Edith Skut.
Having me, and I'm delighted to be here and to share some comments on the issue of how this rule of law agreement has been interpreted from Hungarian perspective, because there has been a huge debate in Hungary whether this was a huge success or a failure for Viktor Orbán. And I think he's most certainly did not fulfill his promises he made for his own electorate that he's going to completely abolish the conditionality itself. From this perspective, this was a failure for the Hungarian Prime Minister. But from the political point of view, I'm afraid that Mr. Orbán will be able to have his cake and eat it too. That's my main concern. And I think it was quite obvious that he would not formally veto the budget at the end of the day. One particular issue with regards to that, like while he was pushing this veto envelope, the Hungarian government, the authorities already submitted their applications for their programs under the Recovery Fund to cement power ahead of the upcoming Hungarian elections. So I would like to highlight two important issues, or two important lessons learned the EU should have learned the last 10 years during the rule of law crisis with regards to Hungary. First is, I think that in order to constrain any authoritarian regimes, time is absolute essence and only prompt action is effective. And from this perspective, the rule of law compromise might be problematic indeed. So since this litigation at the EU Court of Justice usually takes time, usually takes like 90 months, the minimum, Viktor Orbán could still be able to use the EU funds during the upcoming campaign. And also let us not forget that the Commission will have to prove first that a member state is seriously risking the budget integrity in a sufficiently direct way. So I think the clear wording is very much missing here, which is crucial in this very deeply legalized environment, because it just makes things and effective actions a lot more difficult in practice. And I'm afraid that this might result in another never-ending political struggle, much like in the case of Article 7 itself. So Viktor Orbán has been like hugely benefiting from this type of environment of the European Union, the modus operandi of the EU. He's playing dirty where the EU institutions are really based on transparency and accountability, and they are really trying to avoid openly using harsh language towards each other and penalizing the member states, as just Caroline and Gerald already said before. And the second lessons learned is that no matter how many new doctrinal innovations are coming up or last minute compromise are cooked up, I think it all comes down to the political will to restrict backslider regimes. For instance, one of the most effective tool ever of the European Union, the infringement procedures, it's very problematic that they're less and less used by the EU Commission. This is quite worrying. Or to give you another example, it is also telling that the Common Provisions Regulation was never actually used to suspend the EU funds while the Hungarian government was violating the rule of law, and so on and so forth. So my point is that the Hungarian Prime Minister became really a master at formally complying with the formal rules, while substantially undermining democracy, very often in an informal way. And this is how he captured and top-down centralized the media with the help of his cronies, started with the local press in Hungary, and these useful, powerful individuals and companies aligned with Fidesz help to silence the critical outlets. Right now that PKO Orlen is this kind of acquisition that just happened with the Polish regional press shows that this is really the time for urgent actions, because obviously PIS is learning a great deal from Fidesz, how to win the elections with controlling the local press. So very briefly, let me come up with the two recommendations based upon what Gerald Knaus has already said, what the EU could and should do in order to constrain autocratic regimes. One of them is that the Commission has to bring most certainly more infringement actions with applications for interim measures related to Article 7. And although the media freedom is not necessarily or like explicit competence of the Commission, Brussels should and could act fast. It has a very significant responsibility in competition law and state aid, two areas where Fidesz have been very abusing its power to silence the media. And despite this continuing decline in media pluralism, the Commission is still assessing a complaint over state aid for Hungarian broadcast sector, which was submitted in 2016. So again, as I said, these long-lasting procedures are autocrats' best friend at the end of the day. And just to conclude, very briefly, the Court of Justice has to prioritize these issues in order to prevent further harm done by these governments before the damage is done, like what happened with the Central European University, because at the end of the day, this is exactly the cat and mouse game from which Viktor Orbán has been benefiting for like 10 years now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edith. And I would like to hand over immediately to Marcin Kędzierski and then Piotr Arak. Thank you very much for inviting me. And first, two remarks in response to what Gerald Knaus said. Well, it's so easy for states to sell bonds. Well, with all these stimulating funds for the economy, there is actually excess of money on the market, and they are looking, companies are looking for ways to invest. So I think this is one aspect. And second remark, well, what you have been saying, these three countries, Poland, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, in one sentence, you really made my day. But I would like to speak about economic things, because this is what Piotr Buras asked me for. Well, because I'm analyzing the European Union from the economic perspective, and I have to say that the integration, the European integration from the very beginning has been an economic integration as well. If we look at individual states of strength from free trade zone and then single market, currency union, the Treaty of Maastricht, introduction of common currency. What's missing is common fiscal policy, and the last stage would be a political union, which is of course linked to fiscal policy due to the no taxation without representation rule. And of course, the Fund, the Recovery Fund, creates a new space that might change the nature of European integration. And I'm thinking about it also in the context of the rule of law mechanism. And well, let's remember what happened to double majority and the vote on it in the European Council. This mechanism first appeared at the turn of the 20th and 21st century. And for many, many years, it's been discussed in the Constitutional Treaty, then the Treaty of Lisbon. And on the 1st of December 2019, it was introduced, but actually it became binding on the 1st of December 2017, so after the Treaty of Joannin was over. But now the mechanism is there, and nobody has any doubts about it. And an alliance of Germany, France, and the Netherlands can block any decision of the European Union on that basis. So the ability of individual member states to shape the European policy is limited. And it makes it all the more serious, because if we look at the fact that the European Union is moving towards more integration, and due to structural faults of the Eurozone, and it seems that sooner or later some mechanism of the transfer union must emerge in the union in order to keep Italy and Spain in the Eurozone and in the core of the European integration. And this is why certain mechanisms were developed, including the rule of law mechanisms, because it introduces conditionality of spending EU funds. We didn't used to have that. Similarly to double majority for over a dozen years, I think the Nordic countries of the North are preparing grounds for more control over the finances of southern countries for the future, from the moment where some sort of a transfer union will be introduced. So I'm seeing this as a part of a wider process to control how European money is spent. And the rule of law mechanism is a great excuse to introduce this conditionality and to be able to control financing in a more integrated European Union in the future. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Marcin. Piotr, Arak, voice over to you. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me, and thank you for this opportunity to take the floor. I'd like to refer to a few things which haven't been said yet at all, because we have a topic which is related to politics and the summit, and that's important, of course. However, in the midterm perspective, I think it's much more important to think about why certain financial instruments have been introduced. We should not forget that in 2020, the whole European economy had a crisis which can be compared to the crisis from the 20s of the 20th century. And right now, we still have mechanisms which limit the possibility of satisfying consumers' needs. There are millions of people in the south of the European Union who have lost their jobs, but also they have just become poor. They live in poverty right now. And still, towards the end of 2020, a very unlucky way, we've reached a conclusion on how to start stimulating the economy while recovering from the crisis. And as part of this agreement, we have a financial mechanism, which is a big one. So actually we have common debts now. So there are many countries which did not want to take debts to finance the south of the European Union, but this is the case for the first time in the history of the European Union. Another thing is related to taxation. The European leaders now agree to have taxation mechanisms. This could be like a financial transaction tax or a green tax, and also a minimum level of taxation within the European Union. This should be introduced in the next perspective, in the next framework. And for sure, we need this. And everyone has to agree if such taxation is to be introduced. However, we'll have OECD negotiations on the minimum level of taxation. So this notion of base taxation, and this has already been introduced in the USA to fight this Delaware phenomenon of little taxation. And in the European Union, this could be a problem for the Netherlands, because the Netherlands do not see this problem of being a tax paradise when you tax corporations with 10%. And the same thing happens in Cyprus, Malta, and Ireland, and some other countries that have this problem of low taxation. And the other capitals in the European Union, they see this problem. So now it's very important to think about how these two different mechanisms of this taxation reform, which, as I hope, will reduce the effect of international entities on the level of taxation on the EU level, and on the other hand, this possibility to take common debts in the European Union, maybe for a longer time in the future. This means that we now have a perspective of recovering in economic terms. However, we still have a problem of high debts in the south of the European Union, and it will be very difficult for those countries to recover with debt so high. And now I would like to agree with Marcin Kędzierski. No matter how many actions are taken in Italy or Spain, there will be no fiscal space there to deal with the pandemic and its consequences. They will not have enough funds. And that means that the South European Union has lost its competitiveness, and this will be a burden for the whole community in the years to come. And the middle and, well, Central and Eastern Europe will be developing much faster as compared to the south of Europe. Even though there are problems in Central and Eastern Europe, still this part of the European Union will be developing faster as compared to the south. And the Czech Republic, well, GDP per capita is now ahead of Italy and Spain. And I think this is a fundamental question that hasn't been addressed yet, but I think it's important to address them from this economic point of view. Thank you. Thank you, Piotr. Thank you for providing this economic perspective, which is indeed very important. And now Eugeniusz Smolar, and he will be followed by Kinga Brudzińska and Monika Sus. and Agnieszka Smoleńska. Hello. Hello, Roland, and hello, Gerald. I haven't seen you for a while. I think there are more questions than answers. And the questions relate to the functioning of the European Union and will the European Union survive or not? Well, I think it's obvious that the European Union will survive, even if it should be left by some member states. So let's focus on the following question. Will the outcome of this recent summit and the outcome of the whole process that has taken place for 2 years, has this strengthened the European Union? Has it strengthened its decision-making mechanism? This is something that was not discussed during the last summit. However, I think that this is the crucial problem to deal with certain crises, the economic crisis, but also the crisis with Turkey, with China, with the USA, the migration situation in the South. This all leads after the following question: will the European Union, will the core of the European Union, the Eurozone, increase its cohesion and decision-making mechanism? Will we have a bank union after we have a fiscal union? Will we have a social union, which is something we really need? It's about having a level playing field with the UK, but this also applies to the Netherlands, as Mr. Arak was saying, so taxation problem. And this is also related to eliminating the erosion of the basis of the foundation of the European Union. This is not just about Hungary, but also about Italy now. But this is something we've already had for decades. So this mafia structure in Italy, for example, it was everyone knew it was happening, but no one has been able to solve this problem. And now when we talk about values and the rule of law, Patricia Sasna was saying that it is very important to be effective outside of the European Union, to have this perception as a stabilizing force. However, we also need to remember that we need this communication inside of the European Union, because we have new generations, and these new generations need to be shaped in a pro-European way. Otherwise, they could become Eurosceptical. So we need to show the EU citizens that the European Union is useful. And also, we need to perceive all those processes from the point of view of the EU citizens, who need to be convinced that the European Union is beneficial. And the rule of law is maybe a message that will really reach the people, that we'll be able to get across to the people. So I would like to ask some questions. What can we do about the European values instrument? I remember how painful it was to establish the European Endowment for Democracy, because there was this intergovernmental decision-making mechanism. Germany was one of the last countries that made the contribution to this fund, because Germany was not sure to what extent it could be controlled. But we had a similar problem in Paris and in other countries too. Now we have this European values instrument that should be related to the rule of law in the European member states, and there is silence around it, because it's the same mechanism of tough negotiations that is happening. So what should this be? What should be the scope? Who is going to control it? Who is going to manage it? So if you are looking for an instrument to influence the quality of governance in the member states, well, this could be an instrument we could use if it's provided with the right resources and if it's managed well. Thank you. Thank you, Eugeniusz. If someone wants to make some comments to what Eugeniusz was saying, he or she can do it now. And if it's not the case, I would ask Kinga Brudzińska to take the floor from Bratislava. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. just a brief comment and then a question. I would like to tell you how this Hungarian and Polish veto was perceived, or veto threat was perceived in Slovakia. I think it was the first time that there was a difference of opinion between the Visegrad countries, and Slovakia for the first time actually said that it would not join this initiative together with the Czech Republic. It was very critical, and it was saying that it would join the European mainstream to adopt the recovery fund, and it would not exercise its veto or right. And it was saying that we would need this recovery fund to recover from the crisis. Even at an earlier stage, when there was this initiative of Hungary and Poland to establish an institute to protect the rule of law and the democracy. So even back then, there were some critical comments in Bratislava. So I think for Slovakia, it was a big step to make, to oppose to Hungary and Poland. But there have been two debates on this today, and I think there are no illusions of the future of the Visegrad group. The Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, they just know that neighbors are important. So Poland and Hungary are important partners. If these four countries want to have a stronger voice in Europe, however, we can expect these countries to be skeptical when it comes to future initiatives. And also, many people ask themselves, why was there even this threat of exercising this veto right? What was the goal behind it? I mean, we've adopted the fund, so what was this supposed to mean? You know, people are bewildered. They just don't understand what this was all about. Did Poland and Hungary want to make their voice stronger, or maybe did they strive for more isolation? So that would be the perspective of Bratislava. And now a question. We talked about the communication strategy of the European Union and the German presidency, whether it's successful or not. And I think this presidency was also about this conference about the future of Europe. And I would like to ask you now whether you think that the discussions with regard to this future conference at EU level and national level could help us explain the benefits of the European Union for the citizens. Or maybe this conference, or do you believe that this conference could actually give us something new, could bring something new, or maybe it will be what we had before, so some unilateral discussion about the future of Europe and nothing new?
Thank you very much. And yes, as regards this question about the conference, I wanted to add something because there is a question we have from chat. This is a question to Professor Mieńkowska. Andrzej Mierzejski asks how the communication policy of the European Union could be improved specifically. Do you have any ideas? But before I hand over to you, and our three main panelists, thank you very much for inviting me. I wanted to address two questions very, very quickly. First is the autonomy, the strategic autonomy or sovereignty, however we want to describe it. We haven't been talking about it directly today, but indirectly, I think both Roland Freudenstein and Patricia Sasnal addressed it, and I wanted to emphasize this issue, and there were words such as internal strength or external credibility of the European Union, which is strongly affected by problems with rule of law. So with regard to that, if we talk about sovereignty or strategic autonomy of the European Union, we are talking about external credibility, especially in the face of the USA-China strategic conflict. Without a stronger rule of law mechanism, which has not been achieved by this summit, it will be difficult to position ourselves on the global arena as an autonomous actor. In my papers, I usually talk about the force of attraction of the European Union, and I think this is missing. I think lack of a strong mechanisms makes our image actually weaker and less attractive, especially after this summit. Of course, with all due respect to economic questions, which are important as well. Also, a local issue, which, however, is important for the future of the European project, the quickly deteriorating German-Polish relations. Many of us have written about it in different papers and articles, and I think this summit showed it yet another time that the image of Poland in Germany is not at its best, and our veto, our approach to the rule of law have not made friends for us in Germany. And to me, it is very unsettling, especially in the context of the future of the European project. Thank you. I just wanted to ask Agnieszka Smoleńska for her comment, and then we will go back to our three main guests with the questions and ask them for their final statements. Yes, thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share my comments with you. I wanted to go back to the main question of today's debate. Is it a breaking point for a European Union? And in opposition, I would like to emphasize that what we have achieved during the summit was unexpected to many, because we have achieved unity and we were able to maintain the community method. The solution that was adopted is inclusive for the 27 member states. And more than that, the recovery fund that will be funded through the issuing emissions was created on the ruins of the Eurozone budget, we could say in a way. So in a way, it replaces integration at different speeds with a solution that's inclusive towards all member states. Even more than that, this is an argument that we've heard during the debate. This fund will be repaid to a large extent from new own sources of the European Union, including taxes. So despite our discussion about different interests and different conflicts in the European Union, this model of unity, this model based on community solutions has been maintained. And I want to emphasize it because only in this context can we understand what purposes the rule of law mechanisms can serve. In this context, in the context of solutions that serve deeper integration, the rule of law mechanisms is not only a mechanism of control, like Martin said, for example, but at the same time, it is a mechanism for building trust and controlling trust among member states. This control function has a secondary importance. The fundamental meaning is to build more integration in EU 27. Of course, we could ask whether it is sustainable as a solution, so whether EU 27 can really be maintained. And thinking about after Poland and Hungary informed about the planned veto, to look how soon EU25 try to look for solutions. It's an interesting sign, and we will see whether or not in the future member states will look for solutions in the subgroups, or whether the unity will be maintained in order to strengthen European sovereignty, in order to be able to act also on the global scale as a union. So I think it is an important question. How has the European Union been able to maintain EU27 unity? How the roles of individual institutions and actors have been changing. So the success in maintaining unity, whether or not it has in itself seeds of its own demands. Because ultimately, due to the maybe through the role of mechanism, unity may be undermined. Thank you. Thank you very much, Agnieszka. I would like to go back to Gerald, Caroline, and Nacho with a number of questions that have been raised during this highly interesting debate. I know that the scope of topics has been huge, but this was one of the intentions, to have a broad look on what's happening and what will be happening to the European Union, to go beyond the summit and its conclusions, to ask what's in store for us in the upcoming months. What Agnieszka Smoleńska has been saying at the end was quite characteristic, I think. Well, we are still dealing with different dynamics towards more integration and more disintegration. So there are certain processes that push us towards more unity. And Agnieszka mentioned that the summit conclusions are a clear sign that yet again, it has been possible to build a consensus, to find a solution, to define our common goals, to create this recovery fund that we will be paying back together. So this is certainly something that deepens the integration. On the other hand, we hear many signals that the whole construction, this whole structure is shaking. And for example, this threat of a veto before the summit. On the other hand, the threat that the recovery fund will be based on a completely different foundation, not the one that was adopted in the end, as Agnieszka said, but that it would be built based on the coalition of the willing, an intergovernmental agreement. So I think all that in the context of the title of our debate confirms that we might be at a breaking point right now. And the question whether or not it will be our modus operandi in the future. During this summit, we were still able to reach a consensus, but the differences that emerge, also in terms of values, also in terms of rule of law, all these things seem to be of fundamental importance. And my question is whether or not these processes, disintegration processes, will keep coming back. Another question, whether or not the rule of law mechanism, when it is enforced, whether or not it will serve more democratization, more equalization, maintaining unity based on single foundations, or maybe, and this is my additional question, like compared to the attempt to introduce majority vote about the relocation of migrants, whether it will strengthen and exacerbate the tensions in the European Union. And of course, there was the question about the conference, about the future of the European Union, about a possible constitution, whether or not the European Union needs to think again about the foundations, its foundations expressed in treaties, whether or not treaties should be changed. So do you believe that such an attempt would be harmful to European unity? Or is it a necessary prerequisite in order to heal all the cracks that we have seen emerging in the European Union and prevent these cracks leading to maybe not a collapse of the structure, but its weakening in the nearest future? So this is a number of very fundamental questions, it seems to me at least, but we are talking about a breaking point. Anyway, maybe let's change the order right now. I'm not sure if you could answer first, and of course, if you want to respond to any other issues that were raised today, feel free to do so.
No, thanks, Piotr, and thanks to all the panelists for the question. I think it's hard to address them all, and I think they were very, very interesting, very enlightening, and there were more answers even than questions in the questions, because you know a lot about these issues. I'd say that COVID has, to the rest of the world, put the European Union in the spotlight as a space of rights and human values and social capacity and the role of a state and solidarity. No matter how in the first weeks of the pandemic, some countries, fought each other for supplies and so on. But I think, over than that, and I see that from what our Latin American friends see when they look at the EU, they really envy that our society, that the EU has been more resilient because they invest heavily in people, in health systems, in solidarity, in all the structures. And this is, again, in terms of the image and the soft power and the attractiveness of the European model, this is something we should not, on the one hand, take for granted, because we have to preserve it, but on the other hand, we should be aware of the fact that people look at Europe as a space which probably no other in the world has dealt with COVID in such high terms of solidarity and putting people before anything else, and so forth and so on, also in terms of economic policies and so on. I think this is very important. Then my second point is related to Article 7. I think the danger is that people end thinking that this is just something for some member states, that this is just about Poland or Hungary, and that it doesn't apply, or that it's just a marginal discussion, or that these countries are lost or something. Remember that it started all in Austria. That you may have Article 7 situations in France should Marine Le Pen, win an election and start meddling maybe with, immigrants' rights or some on things like that. So let's try and think of Article 7 as a shield to protect us all, not just some people in far-flung places of whom some of them care very little. Just a few weeks ago in Spain, the government had the temptation to change the law as how to the governing body of the judges was elected now under 2/3 of majority in parliament, and because the system is blocked because the opposition party does not want to cooperate with what they think is with the government. In changing this, the government threatened to change the law to move to absolute majority to appoint the judges, and of course, everyone said, "You're crazy! Article 7 will be triggering you." The Polish under Secretary for Foreign Affairs said, "Look, this is exactly what we're doing," and the government in Spain suddenly, they had to they realized that they were doing was utterly stupid, which maybe was not framed in the right way, and so on. So I think this is important for everyone. And the last point is about media freedom, and there I think we should also find the ways, and I think this is much more complicated, because interfering with media freedom, even for the sake of media freedom, is a huge risk. And when governments start doing these things, it can backfire, and you can, most of the times you end up throwing, the baby with the water. But we have to think seriously about this, because we know now, as I don't remember who said that, but I thought it was very important, that those who violate, those who fight against democracy, 95% of the time, they don't need to violate any rule. They do it in a more subtle way, and this is the way democracy is undermined, and it's just 5% of formal violations of rules, which is the type of the iceberg you can fight. But you should concentrate also on things which are under the radar and are much more important, and media freedom and some other things, institutional, the weakening of institutions and many things which you cannot touch, but you can smell maybe, are as important as those things. Thank you.
Thank you, Ignacio and Gerald. Caroline, please excuse me. I was supposed to ask Renata Mieńkowska-Norkiene to take the floor because she had a very specific question related to how the European Union could improve its communication policy. So if you could now take the floor, and then you'll be followed by Gerald and Caroline. Can you hear me now? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, there is another debate at 6 o'clock I have to join. Yes, indeed, I published an article on this. It has a complicated title. However, it's all about having a two-way communication policy in the European Union, and it's based on a theory related to demand and supply. So we've got the money issue, and all the societies in the member states have always believed that this is an important thing. So the European Union is perceived as an ATM to some extent. However, this ATM cannot give you money if you prove that you respect the rule of law. And there is one more thing. It is very often done by the populace, and the European Union cannot do this. And I was trying to give some instructions on how this could be done. And Donald Trump showed this. It's some micro positioning of the message. So that's what the European Union has to do. We need this micro positioning of the message for different target groups, like the Catholics in Poland, for example. And that message should be based on this idea of having the European Union as a provider of financial resources, but also the European Union as a source of values, of Christian values. So there are different media, there are different target groups that are having this debate. We've got Facebook, we've got Twitter, we've got Instagram. So there are different media you can use. And this is happening in the US. So the candidates do this, and Biden did this too. He used Facebook more than the other tools, but he was successful. So I think this is something that can be done. The youth, they are very picky. Professor Markowski showed this, that the youth would always vote for something exotic. Doesn't matter who that exotic party, who that exotic politician is. It must be someone who wants to change the world. And for the youth, we need some communication from the EU that is just more radical, more powerful. We need different communication for business people. So I think the European Union has a lot to offer, and now it is just a task to frame it in a particular way to reach different target groups, so that the European Union can get this message across to different target groups, not just with regard to the funds provided by the EU, but also with regard to the values it represents. And even if it's on a micro scale, some micro messages, it can still be successful because there is this multiplication phenomenon. So if you get your message across to a certain target group, to a certain person, you can hope that this message will be then sent to other people, and you will have this multiplication effect. However, for this, you need a strategy, and that strategy is missing in the EU. And let's be honest, the European Union does not have that, and Mrs. Jourova is not enough. the European Commission is not enough. It has to be done also by the European member states, just as the equality issue or the climate issue. Thank you. Thank you. And now I would like to ask Gerald. We have some 10 minutes left. So now voice over to Gerald. Please be brief, and Gerald will be followed by Caroline. And Gerald, also, it would be nice if you could say a few words about how you see the future of this conflict regarding the rule of law, and what should be or what can be done in the nearest future with this regard. So what would you advocate for? What are your ideas for the future in this regard?
Yes, well, perhaps let me try to answer a few of those questions by drawing a contrast between two different ways in which politics in Europe works. One is, of course, the community method, where, as we've seen, it is very, very hard to isolate any one or two member states and go against them. This is against the DNA of what makes the union work. So it happens very rarely, and it's often not successful. The community method is about compromise, and as Caroline described it at the beginning so very well. The other thing, though, is, and this is essential for the union as well, is the politics of it. We've seen in the US how one election can throw a lot of international alliances, and in the end, even democracy in one of the oldest democracies in the world in doubt. You know, what would we discuss now if Trump would have been re-elected? There could be such an election in France. We don't know. There could be such an election in Italy. We don't know. Hungary is not a big country, so its influence has been limited. In the end, whether Europe holds together will depend on who Europeans vote for. And that is in the end a political issue. So every 10 years that the EU holds together, I think we should be very happy, because we've seen in recent years how fragile all of our institutions are. One or two wrong elections and NATO is in doubt. One or two wrong elections and we have a Brexit. Now, that means that we all have an interest in the politics in each of our countries. And here the paradox comes. Orban realizes this. He has a strategy to try to influence German public opinion, to invest in Slovenian politics, you know, to build alliances. Those who defend the rule of law don't have that. Those who really believe that you know, it matters to the whole union whether there is access to media pluralism in Hungary, don't actually think hard enough how they could help behind the language barrier provide access to media pluralism. You know, why is it just Norway that is the big funder for civil society in Poland? So the idea that Eugenius was pointing out, that this European values instrument, I don't think it will be an EU instrument that will work in the end, but we need a European values instrument by coalition of member states. You know, why aren't there 4 or 5 countries, including the Netherlands, and perhaps Caroline can appeal to the Dutch now that they've said they will fight for the rule of law, just double the funding Norway is giving to civil society. Insist you are funding, you know, groups who fight against LGBT-free cities, or who fight for Roma rights in Hungary, or investigative journalists. And yes, this will lead to political tension, because in the end, it's about political values. So I think we need to go into this direction more. Those who believe in a different Europe than the one some envisage need to fight for it. And that's about communication. But back to the rule of law issues that we face now, there we need something yet again different. We need to strengthen existing instruments. It really is existential if a European Court of Justice judgment, now at the moment it's an interim judgment on the disciplinary chamber in Poland, but if it will be a strong judgment, which we expect, will just be ignored. You know, this is not an issue where we can just, you know, this is the core of the rule of law, both inside the EU and in the member state. And I think we need to prepare public opinion in member states that this is a fight they must not lose. Now, how do we do that? By focusing. You know, what Orban is so good at is telling stories. You know, he has these fantasy stories, but like Trump, he knows if he repeats them 1,000 times, some people believe them. We have much better stories, but we don't tell them very well. Europe has never been as safe, as prosperous, as peaceful, and as confident as it is now with integration. But we need to defend it. It's fragile. It can go. We don't know if it's still around in 10 years. It's always up to us.
Thank you, Gerald. And now, Caroline, so you'll have an opportunity to give us concluding remarks. And maybe you could answer this question about whether integration will prevail in the coming decade over disintegration. And when we've had a breaking point, maybe we have not had a breaking point, but still, can we hope that the European Union will survive the coming decade, and in 10 years' time we'll be still together? What do you think?
Well, now I'm going to look into my crystal ball, and I'll tell you exactly what's going to happen over the next 10 or maybe 10 years or maybe even more. Well, look, I don't know, but I have the feeling that, and I'm not the only one to see this right now, and several speakers have made remarks to the same vein, and that is that actually a lot of people, because Europe is moving into a more hostile environment. The whole world is getting more mercantilist. We're all of a sudden surrounded not by friends, who all want to be like us, as they used to apparently. But I think Carl Bildt has once called this a ring of fire. This actually helps to draw us together. Yes, we always fight in Europe over many, many issues, but at the same time, I have the feeling, and you see this in the polls as well, that Europeans are actually maybe not very happy in the EU, with the EU still as it is. Everybody wants to change it, but they're much happier in the EU than they were before. You don't hear even many populists in many member states, including the Netherlands. They're not talking about an exit any longer. What they're talking about is they want to change the political ball game in Brussels. They're investing in coalitions. They enter the European political game, whereby European politics becomes much more interesting, much more real in a way. For real politics, you always had to go to the member states, where they were debating real issues that people really care about. And Europe was for bananas and what size they were and, technical stuff. But as soon as it touched the people, it was national. Now this is changing. And one of the signs that this is changing is that you saw during the last European elections, for instance, that for the first time since these elections were started, there was an enormous uptick, I think 10% of extra voters. Why? Because people care, it's a form of investment. What I also notice is that a lot of young people are extremely pro-European at the moment. It's mainly the Eurosceptic sounds. I'm not saying it's only the older generation, but mostly the older generation. This is something that I like it when I see that. It means that if they care about the future, and if they start voting or continue voting, all is not lost. Now, so I'm not by nature an optimist, so I'm not too pessimistic about this. When you move to the rule of law, this also has consequences. It is not for nothing that we focus on it now. Yes, the situation has become more difficult in Poland and in Hungary and in even a few other places in Europe. This is the bad news. But the good news is we've looked the other way for years and years. We had the Euro crisis, we had the refugee problem or the migration problem or both. We had Brexit, God knows what else we had. And so we had good excuses to look the other way. We couldn't deal with everything at the same time. Now, in a more hostile environment, I forgot Trump as well, and terrorist attacks and so on. we are drawing together. We are starting to ask, what is it not only that divides us, but also what unites us? This is why the rule of law issue cannot be ignored anymore. You know, when you look at the history of, I think Nacho mentioned it, you know, when Spain wanted to become a member, you know what happened when Spain, when it was still a dictatorship, wanted to become a member of the European communities. It was still an economic club at the time. France and Germany said, yes, why not? Because the rules of the game were only saying that every European country could become a member. It was actually the European Parliament and the Council of Europe that made so much noise and adopted one resolution after the other that made the member states decide, well, maybe we should postpone this. Also for Greece, and Portugal didn't even try because the message was clear. We are very slow in building that instrument. It only got into the treaties with Lisbon, you know, the real, the power for the European Parliament to use Article 7, for instance. All this, it never came from the member states. It came from parliaments, it came from public pressure. And I see public pressure building up. And I said before, member states are very reluctant to act, but institutions can act and people can put pressure on it. So in the end, I am not too pessimistic about all this. Thanks.
Thank you for this great conclusion of our 2-hour debate. So we are not overly pessimistic. I think it's a good thing to say towards the end of the year. So thank you a lot for this conclusion. And I would like to thank all the participants. It's been a great discussion, a fruitful discussion, an interesting discussion. I think that many great ideas have been put forward, many great comments have been made, and I think that we'll remember them during other discussions about the European Union in the future. So I'm very glad to have organized this debate towards the end of the year, and that we have included different perspectives. So thank you for joining us from different parts of Europe. So it's a great advantage of Zoom that we can all come together across borders and without damaging the climate, even though it would be very nice to see you in person in Warsaw, and I hope this will be possible soon. So once again, thank you a lot. Thank you for staying with us. Thank you for following us on YouTube and Facebook. Thank you on behalf of the Batory Foundation and ECFR. I wish you good health and a Merry Christmas in spite of this difficult time, but maybe we'll be more optimistic following today's debate, at least as it comes to the future of the European Union. So see you in the new year, probably.